Let me introduce Troy Davis. Troy Davis is from the World Citizen Foundation. He is a democracy engineer, a political scientist in the area of global organizations. He is a major activist. For 20 years I used to work with him on the World Citizen Foundation about 20 years ago. And he has been on a lifetime mission to promote the creation of accountable global organizations. And so he's going to talk us about from a very wide angle view, what are the challenges which are involved to creating, expanding democracy to the global level, and possibly including in the cyberspace space, and possibly even using the urgency of creating a global governance in the cyberspace as a way to get to the global governance that we need. As a start, before Troy will start, we will present a video of a brief video on the life of Troy's father, Gary Davis, which is the first world citizen which after the Second World War became hugely famous in Europe for advocating together with famous intellectuals like Camus and Sartre in a very public and provocative way the need for world democracy, and you'll see it on the video. I will show this video in the context of basically this great run and basically this great movement that almost created a real democracy after the Second World War. Why? Because there was this great figure of nuclear holocaust could actually be an inspiration now when we are in front of a possible big crisis, including AI, cybersecurity, and other crises. And so this may be an inspiration that creation of a global democracy which is actually working and good may not be such a far-fetched scenario.
Eager to bomb Hitler's war factories. But then he was ordered to bomb a city full of civilians. Horrified at the carnage, he was enraged at the war system. Sure that there must be a better way to run our world, he set off to right the wrongs and prevent World War III. He gave up Broadway and made the whole world his stage. He dared to interrupt the squabbling of nations, to demand that the UN hold worldwide elections of a global Congress to outlaw war and make peace. 20,000 war-weary Europeans rallied with him to demand that the world recognize the rights of humanity.
Sur les difficultés que nous attendent. Mais nous devons choisir entre les difficultés et les massacres de la guerre.
The very next day, the UN unanimously passed the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. With that authority, Gary then staged the most audacious performance of all. He declared a government of, by, and for the people of the world. He gave up his United States citizenship to raise his allegiance to the global level. He became the first official world citizen. His new government issued IDs, marriage licenses, and passports. Nations first rejected them and locked Gary up for failing to have national papers. But amazingly, Hundreds of thousands began to register as world citizens. Nations around the globe began to stamp the world passport. Thousands of refugees and detainees, incarcerated for years for lack of identity papers, obtained world passports, and for many, freedom. Today, Gary Davis still stands up for a world most people can only dream about. A world in which humanity is united. A future in which we free ourselves from the scourge of war and oppression. A world in which we are one.
Okay, so this is the track with very exciting history of Gary Davis and what was almost being achieved. Then the UN was constructed, and it was very much not as powerful as it should have been, not accountable. The democratic system of UN is not working at all, and possibly by the argument of someone, it even prevented real world democracy to be in place. When there was something that looks like it, it prevented a real thing even to be built. And to this date, we have anarchy at global level. We have, and now I'm paraphrasing Gary Davis in one of his videos, as we all agree that it makes sense to have democracy on a city. There's no other better way. We all agree it makes sense to have it at a national level. We cannot agree it makes sense to have it at a continental level. Then we imagine democracy at global level, automatically that's a dictatorship. How does that come? How does it come that cognitively any governance at global level automatically doesn't make sense, and an anarchy or the guys with the most guns and with the most money make sense at the global level? So it's a completely cognitive disconnect that comes through the national propaganda. So this, it's really incredible how this concept that should be so obvious has not been done there. But Troy is going to be able to tell about this and much more, much better than me, and stage is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm not going to go into detail about what happened in 1948 after the war. You can look that up, but I'll try to give a sort of a picture from the ground up. How can we conciliate what seems inconceivable to have a free and safe world? Now, there may be some problems with the version of the slide. Now, we have a dilemma, what we've seen, that if we take the ideals of freedom and safety, total freedom and total safety, they are in fact not reconcilable. They're impossible. They live on a spectrum. You can move the cursor, and every society moves the cursor. But total freedom, we see in Somalia, we have total freedom. Everybody can do whatever they want. It's anarchy. We need some kind of rules. Total safety, we've seen this in dystopias all around. In many science fiction novels, you know, that the world is great, and then you discover there's an underside. Well, again, it looks like it's freedom, but in fact it's tyranny. So we have to decide where to put the cursor. And unfortunately, it's very easy to scare people, say, hey, you want to be safe? You have to give up some freedoms. Well, in fact, we do to a certain extent, but to what extent, that's a problem. But this is the Platonic archetype of freedom and safety. We can optimize society so that we sort of short that line, and we can have a more optimal, we can be reasonably safe and reasonably, whatever reasonably means, free. And we have to do that with good design. Of course, so we have technical design, but we have social design, we have the software, the institutions, and so forth. So in the end, we really have to think about it. It doesn't happen by chance. This is difficult. So, what's the magical ingredient that will allow us to conciliate the both? There's one ingredient, it's trust. We've been talking about trust, right, this entire conference. This conference is organized by the Trustless Computing Organization. We need trust. If we have trust, we can really conciliate both. And what is trust? Well, if you use a machine analogy, you know, the precision with which a machine, the gears and every part, means that it works better together. So that means you really have to think through very, very precisely how things work, and you have to be very minutious and so forth. And we do not do that in general in politics, unfortunately. We do it for technology, but we're not used to doing it in politics, because because there are humans involved. We say we cannot do it, but in fact we can do it. It's also an analogy like oil lubricating. If you have gears, fine, your gears is good, but also you have the oil. Trust lubricates the machinery of society. So, and of course it makes society work better, means we have less conflicts and so forth. So how do we create maximum trust? That's kind of the operational question. Well, we've been doing it for 10,000 years, for as long as humans exist, in fact, even before that, but that's, let's say, recorded history. So let's look at how we've been doing it in the past. Big picture. So why do we dominate planet Earth and not some other species? Well, all human groups need trust. We all need trust. But, in fact, it's the groups that could create trust that therefore are more cohesive, that survived over evolutionary times. So, our species is a natural trust-producing species. You think, oh, it's not true, people distrust each other, but you don't realize. You are living, it's like fish living in water. We live in an environment of extreme trust compared to other species. We take it for granted, and we only notice the differences, but the base level of trust is very high compared to other species. And we took over the world because of that. Because that allowed huge numbers of people and individuals compared to other species to cooperate. And how does it work? Well, because we believe we created a common identity. If I am an Athenian and I say you're an Athenian, what makes us an Athenian? Or what makes us a Spartan? He's a Spartan, he's a Spartan. They have a common identity. And where does it come from? From some kind of creation myth. In fact, you can see that in history. Every single people originally have some kind of creation myth, some kind of origin story, which explains who they are, which explains the identity. Because you need to have the feeling of identity to cooperate. Otherwise, how would you cooperate? Why would you cooperate? You feel you need a bond. The bond creates the trust. The trust is created by the fact that you have this identity. And, of course, if you look at humans, you have concentric circles of identity and then concentric circles of trust. You know the famous saying, me against my brother, me and my brother against my cousin, me and my brother, my cousin against my, and so forth, so on. So we have concentric circles. And so we dominate the earth because we share stories. We believe in stories and we share stories. All our society is based on some kind of shared story. So, we are storytellers and we're story believers. No animal does that. Everything else that we've discovered in the last period of time, animals also do, but they don't create stories. They even have culture, but not stories. So if you have a powerful, compelling creation myth, there's like a competition. Every nation, every tribe creates their own creation myth. What does it do? Well, it creates an identity, which is strong. That identity allows you, convinces people to cooperate, to sacrifice for the group, right? To work hard so the group succeeds better than other groups. And this maximizes the trust between the individuals. I trust you because we're both Han Chinese, or whatever, or Aztecs. So we will cooperate against another group of people. And we have less conflict internally. In fact, you know that most societies, how do they collapse? Some collapse through external conquest, yes, but most societies collapse through internal squabbles. You see that. I keep on studying history because if we don't study history, we will not be able to avoid the mistake that we've been doing for thousands of years. It's very interesting. Even though some things are different because of technology, still the human factor is the same. As Armstrong said just before, the human factor between Roman Empire and Switzerland today is the same. The only difference is technology and organization. So we can learn from human factor. And if we have this creation myth, it allows the group to expand, to conquer other groups who also have their own creation myth, but they're not as powerful. What does it mean powerful? It means cohesive. I'm not saying about good or bad. Okay, this is not a moral issue. This is an issue of efficiency of the myth. For instance, you could say the success of Islam in the 7th to 8th century was because their myth was more powerful than the myth of Christianity at the time, which had kind of worn down. If you look at the Byzantine Empire, they were kind of very corrupt, and they managed to conquer many lands because they had sort of some cohesion with this new faith, a new story. It's a shared story, which was more powerful, which motivated them. Of course, there are always details and lots of so on, but generally speaking, that's what happened at that moment. And so we today, we are the result of thousands of years of an evolutionary arms race between competing stories, between competing myths. You could say that capitalism is a myth that a story which won over communism. That's also another, it's a shared story. Money, different ways of organizing the world economically, money is also a shared myth, a shared story. Companies, organizations, foundations, associations are all shared stories. They're legal fictions, right? We know that. The big difference between animals and us, they don't create organizations. That's why we can have a million, we can have an organization with 1 million strong membership or employees, and we can do great things which other animals cannot do because they don't cooperate. You can never have 1 million chimpanzees cooperate. They kill each other. You can have a band of 10, 20 chimpanzees fighting against another band of 10, 20. That's about the limit. So, a brief history of the technologies of trust. 50,000 years ago, you didn't need them. Very small groups around the landscapes. 20,000 years ago, you had small bands. Trust is directly mediated, immediately. I know what you do, you know what I do. 10,000 years ago, the first villages, a few hundred people. Then you start to have to know who's what, sort of so on. The first stories emerge. 5,000 people, the first cities. Thousands of people, tens of thousands of people. So the myth complexified. This is the first story that we know of. The story of Gilgamesh, king of Uruk. 4,000 years ago, the first nations, the first empires, the first gods, millions of people. 2,500 years ago, the first democratic system. It's also another story. It's a different story from autocracy, from God ruling by the king or the king ruling on the authority of God. It's just another story, right? But it's a more efficient story. So in the end, it took a long time, but it won. Well, it won. So far. 19th century, nation-state era. We created many of the nations. Italy, we created Italy on some founding myths. We created France. We changed the myth over time in France. Finland, take Finland, the case of Finland. A wonderful book, case study of myth-making. They literally, and what the irony is, it was a Swedish man, Professor Lönnrot, from the Swedish minority, which was at the time Finland was a duchy of the Russian Empire. Went around and collected, they said, we have to fight the Russians, but we're only a minority. 80% are Finnish peasants. They're unorganized. They don't have a national consciousness. What do we do? We're going to create national consciousness. How? He went around the villages, he collected all the folklore. He wrote it down in Finnish. He called it the Kalevala. It was published, and then every Finnish child, including the Swedish minority children, learned the Kalevala. And suddenly they said, we are Finns. We have a shared history. This is an amazing, real story of how we literally, artificially built out of informal chaos. We built a nation, a modern nation. This was 1860, not so long ago. But we see this over and over again, all around the world. So this is not just ancient times, this is also modern times. What about today? Well, today the world is very thickly interconnected, thickly, like with cables everywhere. So we have these old trust technologies, but they're not efficient. You're not efficient for the bandwidth of all those interactions, more than 7 billion people, all our problems. So what are those old trust technologies? Well, the national creation myths, which is just a subspecies of shared story, right? National constitutions, basic rule of the game. National citizenship, which was also an invention, recent invention. Of course, the material technology. Some material technology is not efficient enough. That's one of the things that Rufo is trying to invent here, and other people trying to invent more efficient technologies to make it work. Money is also a type of a shared story. So we need to update our old technologies, our old trust technologies. By the way, it's the first time that I use this term. I had writing this for this conference, I came up with the term of trust technology. I don't know if anybody has ever heard it before. I hadn't heard it before, but so I liked it, and so I used it. So, but what are we going to update them to? Well, I made a little table. You can see. Well, we need some kind of. If we are to have a world citizenship, I should have put it in a different order. I'm going to do that later. We should have a global creation myth, because citizenship comes from identity, which comes from a shared story, which is the creation myth, right? So we need a global creation myth. But okay, how to do it is another thing. I don't have the time. I researched that, but this is one thing we should do. We should have basic rules of the game, like a constitution. Maybe Universal Declaration of Human Rights can be a Bill of Rights for the world, right? I mean, that would be logical. That's what it was supposed to be. We should have some kind of body to make decisions, which is legitimate. I called it World Parliament. We called it something else, but just shorthand. And, okay, maybe this is a bit weak. We'll have to see how we have to create some systems, material systems, where the trust is more intrinsically built in, which is what the organization here is trying to do. So what makes democracy work? Well, it works because people trust it, because they consent to it. If people don't consent to democracy, but not only democracy, any system, right? Democracy even more. If people don't consent to it, it fails. But why? The funny thing is that science has shown that primates, going back at least 30 million years, we have a built-in sense of justice. This is amazing. So morality and justice have nothing to do with somebody saying, hey, just a couple thousand years ago, God appeared on earth and said we have to be moral. No. This is built in, which is good. So we accept voluntarily what is fair, and we obey something which we perceive as legitimate. So advance in democracy, advance in perceived fairness and legitimacy, which have to be congruent, of course, with reality in the end, trust. So this increases compliance naturally, because we have the problem of compliance. Also with hackers, whatever, people could be malevolent. Well, if even hackers, if they think things are fair, they will be more likely to obey the system. And this allows us to square the circle of safety and freedom. Okay, so I'm just going to finish quickly. The case for global democracy, we need global legitimacy. So some kind of democratic governance underpinned by an identity of world citizenship. We're all humans. We know we're all humans, right? But this is biological. It's not a political identity. We need global creation myth, the appropriate software. This allows us to answer the question about the certification body. Who certifies certifiers? It's like the GDPR. Who gives authority to GDPR? It's the European Parliament, right? If it didn't exist, nobody would think it's legitimate. The case. What are the source of risk? The international system is chaotic, so global democracy is the answer. Criminals are enabled by what? Scarcity, corruption, violation of rights. If you reduce that, again, you improve, you reduce the power of criminal again. So it's coming back to global democracy. Psychopaths. Psychopaths can only succeed also if they're helped by other people. Just as super empowered individuals that are like cancer cells in the body. It's only through social pressure, like the immune system of people who believe the system is legitimate and fair, that we can minimize the risk. We can never take it away completely. Okay, I think that's it. Advantages of global democracy. I'll leave it for you to read quickly, but The bottom line is people don't realize, visualize the advantage. It creates a virtuous circle of abundance and stability. That's what we need to do. As long as we don't have some kind of global system which is seen, perceived as fair and legitimate, we will drift inevitably towards more surveillance, towards more autocracy, towards more wars and so forth. Thank you very much.
Okay, good conversation. We can continue the discussion on a panel that's going to follow up, which we're going to merge the challenge the panel and the open panel just because we're late, and they're going to touch on the same points. Just one follow-up on what you said on the story now, the Italian, which is very fascinating. It seems that in history, the story of the city was overwritten partly by the story of the nation, because the only way to write the story of the nation was to undo the fact that you're not that different. You have a larger thing.
Or to appropriate the story. Also.
Even more interesting. So not to override in a how you say,
not to delete
deleting the differences, but inserting this difference in a wider view. I think the challenge that we have in the creation myth is to, in a way, undo, in a way, absorb these national differences and have a global human myth now to arise. And also religions, of course, are part of the picture.
When I say myth, it doesn't mean it's not true. I mean, it has to be based, obviously, on science and fact, which will be different, okay? But when I say creation myth, it responds to both the brain and, let's say, the emotional part of humans. It's not, that would be the difference between today creating sort of this creation myth and in the past. Yes?
I was wondering, there are animals that can organize, like ants. Did you think about them?
Yes, of course. But the difference is that ants organize locally. They don't organize over time, over the space that we can organize. We can organize over millions of square kilometers. They organize over thousands. The biggest ant colonies, I think, in the world are, well, there are millions of ants, yes, but they cover several square kilometers. But you will not find an ant colony which covers an entire continent, for instance. And they fight other animals, they kill other animals, that's true. But ants, for instance, will not create also, will not go into space, will not conquer another environment than the environment they were designed for. They will not go underwater, for instance. So it's true, ants do that. But the only other organisms that are very large that cooperate, it's not, in fact, it's simple organisms. I think there's like a giant mushroom, the oldest, biggest organism on Earth is like a giant sort of mushroom which covers thousands of square kilometers under the Earth, kind of grows. But this is a botanical oddity. It's not something competition, for us.
What makes you believe that a global democracy is desirable?
It's desirable.
Yeah, because you said it's desirable.
Yes, for the simple reason, I tried to explain it maybe, for the simple reason that humans are hardwired to follow or obey voluntarily what they perceive to be fair and legitimate.
Yes.
Okay? So, this is hardwiring. This exists for millions of years, even before. So, but this is every level. This is every level. So that's why if the system, if they perceive a system is not fair and legitimate, they will simply not adhere to it. They will not obey it. So if they think that, for instance, you should have freedom and democracy, just like Rufus said before, not people at the city level, why should you have it at the global level? Why should you have a dictatorship or anarchy at global level, but you have democracy at the local level? It doesn't make sense. There's a cognitive dissonance. Cognitive dissonance is one of the biggest problems in humans, and humans try to reduce cognitive dissonance. So it's normal that they will try to apply the same principles from one level to another. This just like, for instance, why are people against corruption? Because when you grow up, your parents tell you, don't lie, don't cheat, don't steal, don't beat up on the kid next to you, don't steal his lunch at kindergarten, whatever. So they teach you to be moral, right? Suddenly you go out in the world, you become a grown-up, and suddenly you say, wait, but look at the politicians, look at those guys over there. I was taught to be moral, I have certain, but they're not applying the same rules. You're unhappy. Maybe you start cheating yourself, not paying your taxes, and so forth and so on. So you opt out of the system because there's a cognitive dissonance, and You are maybe depressed also. Many people are depressed and they think, why is there so much misery in the world?
And the global thing will fix that part. You see. I mean, if
It's
we're
coherence
global-
because it has, take an example what happened in Syria. Why do we have today such a reaction in Europe, Brexit and populist parties? Take away Syria, you have millions of refugees that came into Europe and there was a reaction against that.
Yes.
Take
Okay.
Trump, there's a reaction against Trump because of the immigrants.
I'm sorry, I think it's a really interesting conversation. It's just, of course, with the themes we're touching, it's very easy to go on and on. It's quite complex. So, thanks, Troy, for this information.